You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Welcome to the Christ and Classics podcast, where we attempt to read great books in light of the Christ. Books from all stripes, ancient, modern, but we try to stick to books that have shaped large swaths of people across the ages. So by nature, we prioritize old books, and I've got a I guess we're friends. I've known you for a few months. I had the pleasure of meeting you for the first time in person back in October at the CiRCE Institute's regional conference. Matt Bianco, what exactly do you do at CiRCE again? What's your technical title?
My technical title is Chief Operations Officer.
Okay. Oh yeah. And what does that look like practically for you?
Very operational stuff.
Yeah.
I trying to keep the systems and get systems and processes to keep us all going and bring some order to some of the chaos that comes when you float around in ideas. And
yeah, you were real generous back in the summer to come on our little show to talk about homeschooling. That was really fun. And here recently, you've agreed to read a Platonic dialogue, Plato's Meno, with me. It's kind of a new trend we're doing, as I was just saying earlier. We're reaching out to folks if they would like to read a book with us, and usually it take about a month or two, depending on how far in advance we plan. And this is the first in that series. The next, actually, in a couple of weeks, Holly Ordway is coming on to talk about the Hobbit with us.
Nice.
And then my newfound cousin, Buck Holler from the CiRCE Institute. How about that? We're going to discuss Julius Caesar in March. That's pretty wild, isn't it?
Yeah. When you said earlier about us being friends, I was like, we kind of have to be, because you're cousins with one of my friends. So.
Yeah, we're like fourth cousins. Like, I went to that conference in Dallas and loved Buck's talk on poetry. We have a similar rodeo background, love for ancient languages. And it turns out we're like third or fourth, I think it's like fourth cousins, something like that.
Yeah.
We live like, so, yeah. Well, we've only got about an hour here, a little less than, to discuss the Meno. And I have some personal questions for you before we get started to talk about Plato in particular. The first is, what's your background with Plato? When were you first introduced to him, and how has he been involved, so to speak, in your life ever since?
Yeah. I think my first, it's kind of weird because when my wife was pregnant with our second son, which would have been in like 90, he was born in 98, so early 98, so 97. We were talking about names, and I wanted to name my son Socrates.
Okay.
And my wife vetoed it, so his name is Andrew.
Good biblical name.
Yeah. And well, at first I wanted to name him Socrates. She vetoed that. Then I wanted to name him Shakespeare, and she vetoed that. And so we ended up, there were a couple other names along the way, but we ended up with Andrew. Well, actually Morris. His name was Morris after my great-grandfather. So she accepted Morris because it was my great-grandfather's name. But I don't know why. I don't really remember why I wanted to name him Socrates. Like, I hadn't read Plato at that point, I don't think. I think I just liked what he represented, maybe by reputation or culturally, you know?
Uh-huh.
And maybe that was about it. This is 2011, though. It was like 14 years later when I finally read Plato for the first time. And and I read Gorgias, and then I read Meno a year later, and then Phaedrus, and then somewhere in there I also read like the Apology and Credo, and I don't remember what else, but anyways, and I think at first I thought he was fine. Like I liked him, but I didn't have the same, I didn't have the immediate love or appreciation that I have for him today. It was when I was working on my PhD and I was trying to narrow down my dissertation thesis. And I had it narrowed down to like 3 different options. And I was talking to my advisor, and he said, "Well, you work for CiRCE, right?" I said, "Yeah." And he's like, "Do you like your one choice was something to do with Homer?" And he said, "Do you guys have like a Homer expert or you know at CiRCE?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, kind of. Andrew Kern's pretty much our Homer guy." And the other one was on literature, and he's like, "Do you guys have literature and a literature expert?" I was like, "Yeah, pretty much everybody who is a literature expert." He's like, "What about Plato? Do you have a Plato guy?" And I was like, "No, I don't actually think so." So that's kind of why I did it. He just thought that would be the best.
Oh, so your dissertation was on Plato.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
But he encouraged me to choose Plato because he thought that would allow me to bring the most benefit to CiRCE.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I just did it because he said so. And and then I just started reading Plato constantly. I read The Republic probably 8 times
All right.
during that time, and I read all of the dialogues, even the spurious ones, at least once through. So.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Okay. Yeah, I didn't realize he was you were that involved with him. I knew you had read you were well read just based off just like some inferences I could make from some conversation we've had. But well, I'm the young buck here as far as Plato. I didn't know anything about classical Christian education until I was in seminary and began teaching for a liberal arts college there. And I wanted to read all the books, all the classics like Plato and Aristotle these college students were reading. I just didn't have time because I had my own massive load to read. And so when I started teaching in a classical Christian school, middle and high school, I began asking them, "Hey, what are you guys reading? 'Cause I'm going to read with you." And so I would read alongside these ninth graders who were in a humanities class. And I think my first introduction to him was reading Euthyphro and the Apology and Credo.
Yeah.
And I just thought, like, wow, this is this guy's something to really consider.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've read those. I've poked around in the Republic, but I haven't delved into it. And then I've read Meno. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what I can learn from you. Why don't we do this? Let's just give a brief, broad overview summary of the Meno, and then I want to ask you a question about Socrates' final answer to the original question.
Yeah.
Because I think it seems to be a really important, like a really important philosophical point, but also like a pedagogical model for
Mm-hmm.
question asking. So Meno begins with asking Socrates a really interesting question that I had never considered before, like whether or not virtue can be taught or not, or do you know what virtue is by nature? And he let me pull up my notes here. Yeah, that's right. He asks, he tries. Well, Socrates basically says, "Hey, wait, we can't even get to that question before we even know what virtue is." And then Meno tries to define it in terms of various kinds, virtues of a man, virtues of a woman, and Socrates is like, "Wait, you're not really getting to the question because those are just examples of what virtue could look like. What is virtue even below that surface?" And Meno's like, "Well, what about like the ability to acquire things, wealth, power, and so forth?" And he's like, still no, because you need like justice, moderation in order to be virtuous. Like, what is it? What is it? And so like the whole dialogue seems to be this quest for how can we search for something without knowing what it is? How can we search for virtue without knowing what it is? And if we know what it is, why ask in the first place?
Right.
And most of the dialogues centered around, well, it goes in the direction of that question as a way to answer the first question, whether or not virtue, whatever it is, can be taught or if it's something you get to by nature. And then they go through several examples with like a slave boy and geometry. Another friend comes in and they talk about it. And Socrates is like, at the very end, I've concluded that virtue cannot be taught. It's not pure knowledge, and nobody's worthy to teach it if it were. And so it's got to be something imputed to you by divine inspiration, by God himself, a divine gift. And it's like, oh, as a reader, you're like, wait, that's the answer? What? I thought we were going to answer this thing.
Right.
But I loved it. I loved that it closed that way. And my thought to you is, why did I guess let me frame it. Is Plato being honest with himself by answering the question that way? Or is he trying to make another more profound point by not really answering the question?
Right. Yeah. Man, that's a good question. I mean, it's a great question. And I don't even know what I believe. I mean, I have different ways of understanding it that I've wrestled with over the years. And probably like sometimes I choose A, sometimes I choose B, sometimes I choose C, sometimes I flip back to A. And I'm not really sure. I mean, the easiest thing to do is just take it on face value, right? Like Socrates believes it's a gift from God.
Yep.
Which a large swath of the Christian tradition would agree,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, yep, we can only be good because God enables it.
Yep.
It's kind of dissatisfying, I think, from the perspective of a parent or teacher, because we want it to be possible for us to cultivate virtue or to teach virtue to our children or our students. And then if it's like, well, that's not possible, only God can do it, then what's our job? Like, it can be dissatisfying for many teachers and parents. It can be freeing for others, right? Because then that's not my responsibility. All I can do is maybe the way to put it would be to prepare the soil. I can prepare the soil.
Yep.
And so it can be freeing and liberating for a lot of parents and teachers in that way. So I think the face value answer is more or less satisfying depending on kind of where you are, in your own understanding of it. One of the things that I've wondered a lot in my reading of it is Meno asks, can it be taught? And Socrates says, how can we answer that question? Like you've already said, how can we answer that question if we don't know what it is? We have to talk about what it is first. Meno seems shocked that Socrates is willing to admit that he doesn't know what virtue is. But they go through this conversation about trying to answer that question first, right? What is virtue? And in the end, Meno kind of pulls back and says, look, can we just answer the question that I asked? Right? Like, we don't know what virtue is. We're not getting anywhere with that conversation. So can we just answer my original question? And then Socrates basically says, okay, then sure. If we're going to be forced to answer the question based on only what we have figured out up to this point, no, it can't be taught, right? It's not pure knowledge, like you pointed out. And then Meno is kind of left to go on his own. If Socrates is staying true to what he says at the beginning of the dialogue, that we can't teach virtue, or that we can't know if we can teach virtue without knowing what virtue is, and the dialogue ends with Meno saying, I still don't know what virtue is, then Socrates' answer may be less of his own perspective on it, like what he actually believes. And it might be something more like, I'm not going to give permission to somebody who doesn't know what virtue is to teach virtue, right? Like, if you don't know what it is, I'm not going to give you permission to teach it. So I'm going to declare that in your case, because of your circumstances, I'm going to say, well, as far as you're concerned, it must be something that only God can give. And so I wonder I've wondered at times if he's simply offering the answer that Meno has to have. Kind of like whatever. If your young child came and said, "Hey, can I go use the chainsaw?" and you might say no, right? Like, no, you can't use the chainsaw.
Yeah.
And what you really mean is no, not right now, because you don't know how to use it properly, and you're not physically developed enough to handle it properly. It's too strong for you; it would overpower you, right? But unless they push us and ask why, right? We don't necessarily explain all that. We just say no, you're not allowed to touch the chainsaw, and then, but there's some like the child eventually figures out that the rules change based on, and we figure out that the rules change based on their maturation, right? So it could be something like that. The third thing, though, that somebody else pointed out to me, another teacher a long time ago, which I've often found interesting, is that Socrates actually says, his very last little kind of closing speech says, in my translation, he writes, it follows from this reasoning, Meno, that virtue appears to be present in those of us who may possess it as a gift from the gods. We shall have clear knowledge of this when, before we investigate how it comes to be present in men, we first tried to find out what virtue in itself is. But now the time has come for me to go. You convince your guest friend Anytus here of these very things of which you yourself have been convinced, in order that he may be more amenable. If you succeed, you will also confer a benefit upon the Athenians. And what I think is interesting there is he not giving Meno permission to teach virtue to another, right? He doesn't use the word virtue there, but right, is in some sense that's what he's actually giving him permission to do, teaching him to do. But maybe he's limiting his audience to Anytus, and he's forcing him into kind of a relational way of teaching it, rather than Meno's standard practice, which is to go in front of large audiences and give speeches.
Interesting, because is Socrates saying that he's giving Meno permission to go and to persuade Anytus about the knowledge or understanding to the degree that he currently has it,
right?
And not just virtue, that there's an inherent value, it seems to be assumed, in this whole conversation thus far. That the fact that we haven't answered the question is irrelevant to the value of the conversation that's just had, because it's worthy enough to be passed on to another man, even if that question is not answered fully.
Right. Well, and then maybe the question is not answered in words, but to what extent was it demonstrated by the pattern of the conversation, by the example of the conversation with the slave boy? Even though the conversation with the slave boy is specifically answering this other question about, can we pursue something that if we don't know what it is, if we don't know what it is, how will we recognize when we see it? And then and this idea that Meno is frustrated because Socrates has numbed him, is the word he uses, right? But he thought he knew what it was, and now he doesn't. And Socrates has taken away kind of his certainty, and so the conversation is kind of like addressing those 2 points. And yet I wonder, in some sense, if virtue is the thing that's being embodied, that also reveals the answer to those 2 points.
Is there any other dialogue or writing of Plato that touches on virtue in itself that might corroborate some of what we're talking about here?
I don't I don't think there's a dialogue that's specifically about the term virtue or the idea of virtue. There are multiple dialogues that deal with particular virtues and the interrelationship between them. Like the Republic is basically talking about the four cardinal virtues, where one part of the soul / city is governed by temperance, another part is governed by courage, another part is governed by wisdom, but then the relationship between the three of those is justice. And he talks about those as virtues, of course, but he doesn't put those in. He doesn't. I don't think he rises up to that higher level definition like he's demanding in Meno of what virtue is itself. And then you can see that in a lot of them, like there's like any of the dialogues, like there's one about courage, there's one about temperance, there's one about well, whatever it is. I mean, any of the ones that are about any of the virtues they talk about those specific virtues, but not necessarily that virtue itself as explicitly.
Yeah. Okay. So a paragraph or so before that final paragraph that you just quoted, Socrates, it's actually his words that he says right before that. At least in my translation, it's the second sentence. It says, to sum up our inquiry, the result seems to be, if we are at all right in our view that virtue is neither natural nor acquired, but I'd like to look at the Greek here. It says, but an instinct given by God to the virtuous. Nor is the instinct accompanied by reason, unless there may be supposed to be among statesmen someone who is capable of educating statesmen. So he says that virtue is an instinct given by God to the virtuous. I haven't looked at the original here to see what that word instinct really could connotate, but I circled it and I thought, oh, like to think of examples of virtue such as justice, temperance, courage, all being undergirded by a common instinct, a thread, kind of like this pure matter, if you will, or like atoms that run through all of creation, right?
Right.
What is that? And he says it's not knowledge, and it's not accompanied by reason. He says it's not lest it could be taught. That's bewildering to me because I've got this biblical framework that just runs through my entire psyche of, okay, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Like there's a necessary teaching involved there, and there's virtue there. Like I'm seeking to imitate, Paul says, the Lord Jesus Christ by my words, my actions, virtues, we may say. And I want you to look at me, learn from me, and do what I do. And it's hard for me to think of virtue without being taught it. But then there's that piece of Romans 1 where man knows what is right from wrong from birth. He's born with an innate sense of right and wrong at a fundamental level. He knows that lying and stealing, for example, a little 2-year-old doesn't have to be taught. Well, maybe this is what Plato's getting at. A little 2-year-old doesn't have to be taught that lying is wrong or stealing is wrong. He just does it and knows that he shouldn't. Yeah. And conversely, he knows that he should tell the truth and be honest. And maybe that's the innate thing that Plato's trying to latch onto and explain.
I think so. I mean, there are other dialogues where Socrates makes it clear that he believes that we have like an innate knowledge, but he sees it as something that we have to like we have to cultivate the recollection of it. Like we forget it or we suppress. Romans might say we suppress it.
Yep.
Socrates says we've forgotten it
Yeah.
because of the difficulty of birth, traveling through the channels of the womb. Right? It's like the stress of that makes us forget it. But also like just the world around us, like our own brokenness, the brokenness of the world around us, circumstances, all of those things cause us to forget. So we need some sort of recollection. In my translation, though, it says something interesting. After that part where it talks about, mine just says as a gift. Mine doesn't have the of instinct. But those who possess it as a gift from the gods, which is not accompanied by understanding. Yours says reason there.
Mm-hmm.
And then it says, unless there is someone among our statesmen who can make another into a statesman. And of course, there's a section in here where they go through several statesmen and say, did this statesman, did he train up sons who were as virtuous or more than he was? Like we think of this guy as being virtuous. Was he able to pass that virtue on to the next generation? And in their conversation, they say no to all of them, to all of those people. So he does seem to be saying here, we have to conclude at this point that it's neither inborn or taught, but it's a gift from the gods, unless we find this statesman who can do it. If we can find an example of a statesman who's done it, well, that statesman has come. We call him Jesus, but maybe. I mean, surely there are humans that. Well, I mean, Paul identifies himself as a human that does it, but then also has to qualify that, right? Imitate me insofar as I imitate Christ. If I fail, then you should fail to imitate me. So there's definitely something that we can see more clearly that changes, and maybe that is the answer to Socrates' kind of caveat there, right? Right.
Yeah, and so if you keep reading in that section, like right after that, he compares this hypothetical one to he says basically what CiRCE was among the dead, this one, he alone would have understanding, but the rest of humanity are fleeting shades. Like if there was this one who could come and teach the statesman virtue, he would be like CiRCE was among the dead, the only one really living, and the rest were shades. And it's like that's a great image of Christ, the one teacher, and in relation to him, we're just but fleeting shadows of the thing itself. I mean, and we are in his image. So there's a whole theology of imagery there that can be woven into what Plato seems to be groping towards.
Right. So then we as parents and teachers, if we can see Christ, which we do, right? If we can see Christ as satisfying what Socrates is describing here in this paragraph, or in this part of his response, and we do, then we can participate in the teaching of virtue in the same way Paul does, right? By imitating Christ as parents, as teachers, but also with that kind of safety mechanism, I guess, of but imitate me only insofar as I imitate Christ,
Right. Yeah.
Though children don't necessarily pick up that distinction, right? That's the hard part, is that they imitate us when we don't want them to imitate us.
Yes. Yeah. And even, well, and the converse is true as well. And in some cases where a child will refuse to imitate his parent because the parent has failed in some regard and he doesn't want to be like that at all. But I mean, at that point, from a Christian perspective, I think that's where lots of humility and repentance and conversation happens when we fail as parents. my kids are getting to the age to where, like, if I fail, I've really hurt them.
Mhm.
You know, when they're really little, 2, 3, 4, even 5, if you say get too angry with them, it's like water rolling off a duck's back for them. But when they get older and you have a sharp tone out of just a simple reaction, that could really it really harms them. Like, they're growing into little maturing human beings that you have to be gentle and wise with. So so this is very interesting because it's like we're talking right now as if we have some kind of understanding of what virtue is. But you and I haven't yet defined it.
Right.
So we have this, I mean, I don't know what the word is, but mine says instinct. We have this intuition of what we think virtue is. We could call it righteousness. God would probably call it holiness. But we haven't yet defined it in terms of Plato or in terms of the Bible and Christian tradition. If your kids came up to you currently, like today, this afternoon, hey, what were you doing this afternoon? Oh, we were just talking about virtue. Oh, what is virtue? What would you say to them?
Yeah, good question. And I should answer this so it can be recorded for all posterity. This is like the one time I'm going to hope nobody listens to a podcast. I hope we get no listeners for this.
Socrates himself can't answer it, so
okay. I'll just throw it out like this. This is probably the closest I can get, and it's not. Well, it just is what it is. I think that human beings and everything that exists that God has created, including through us, has a nature, and it has a proper purpose, a telos, right? A telos that God has given it, and therefore everything that we interact with, internally to myself, I interact with myself internally, right, and then with you and the people around me, and with the things around me, the tree, the waterfall, the sunset, sunrise, and whatever, a knife, table. Everything has to be interacted with appropriately. It is appropriate for me to treat you like the image of God, to interact with you as the image of God. And as well as, things that are a little bit more particular to you as Colton Moore, right? It is appropriate for me to interact a certain way with my 2-year-old, my kids when they were 2, like you were describing, and then again when they're 12 and when they're 22. And it is appropriate for me to interact with, or to respond perhaps to, as Lewis writes in the beginning of The Abolition of Man, to respond to the beauty of the waterfall in a certain way, the sense of awe and respect. And so I think that acting in accordance with our nature and our telos, but acting properly with with respect to the nature and the telos of the other thing that I'm interacting with, that sense of propriety is that's virtue.
If I understood you correctly, you said virtue is acting. How about acting acting, behaving, existing in accordance to the dignity of your nature and the person or thing with whom you're engaging.
Yes.
And that's good, because that I like that. It makes a way for there to be a virtuous virtuous love versus a sinful love, virtuous punishments versus sinful punishments. I think we have this category in the scriptures too: virtuous killings,
Right.
and immoral, sinful murder. There was I don't know who it was. I went to a small evangelical reformed seminary. Had a great time there. One of the professors, I remember it being in class. We were in systematic theology 2, I believe, and we were dealing with the doctrine of God. First semester was all about epistemology and how we understand things and some of the history behind it. And then semester 2 was, okay, we're doctrine of God and doctrine of man and so forth. And there was one of the seminary brothers, I think, reflecting on Bavinck, the Dutch Reformed theologian, and said that God is God. When God communicates himself, it is God. And then when God comes in contact with creation, and he has to interact, and he interacts with creation in a variety of different ways, it is manifolded in a bright spectrum of colors: wrath, love, patience, forbearance, anger. He's sad, indignant, but all these attributes, so to speak, are just a refraction of God communicating God with the creation. And it seems that we're talking about virtue in a similar way, that virtue is refracted as pure light through a prism that manifests itself in many of the ways that Meno was describing in the dialogue. And so, and I'm amazed that when I talk with my children about these similar kinds of matters, they're still really young, 6, 7, or 6, 8, and wow, he's going to be 11 soon. They understand this. The young ones, like, hey, there's a difference between being untruthful and we call it a lie, and being untruthful and you're just wrong or mistaken, or the difference between murder and maybe a righteous act of killing. So I think that's helpful. It reminds me of some things we've read about in Jonathan Edwards as well, back in the day.
I think I like it because it also makes sense of why justice and courage and temperance and wisdom are kinds of virtues, but they also hold that same. They also have within them that same characteristic, that same quality, right? So, justice, we could say, is perhaps is interacting with something that has violated its nature and telos, right? And then trying to correct that. And courage is calling forth a response according to my nature and telos that I may not want to do, and I have to force myself to do it in the face of fear or whatever, right? Or danger.
Yeah. And too much courage could lead to an overestimation of your capacities. Pride. Too little courage leads to cowardice. So it seems like there's this balance of temperance as well. I've read a little bit of, back in the day, it was back when I was reading with all these high school students. They were reading through Aristotle's Ethics. I made it halfway through with him, and oh gosh, he said something similar, and I can't remember exactly what he says about too much courage leads to this, too little courage, too much this, too much that.
Right.
Which is something I really struggle with. I can go to extremes and really struggle to have a midway balance. But
yeah, that whole ethics is an attempt to define all of the virtues and ethical qualities that he lists. Is an attempt to define kind of this middle way where you have the excess of it on one hand and the deficiency of it on the other hand. So an excess of courage, I think, depending on the translation, is like a rashness, and then the deficiency of courage would be cowardice, of course, right?
Yeah. So as we kind of wrap up here, I have another thought that's related to this, and I've been really influenced by Jacob Klein, particularly one little speech he gave back in the 70s at St. John's College. And the speech, it's a 2-page speech, and it's titled Discussion as a Means of Teaching and Learning. And I read this little 2-page essay with my students every year. And I refer to it in word and in theory whenever we have a discussion, particularly a Socratic seminar, whenever I lead one with them. And the biggest takeaway for me from that little 2-page speech was this: that the goal of education, or the goal of asking questions, you could say, is not necessarily to answer the question, so much as it is to see the range of options that you can choose from. Now, there's likely going to be a lot of wrong options that you've got to weed through, but the process of bringing those and laying them on the table, and we've got these options to choose from that lead to other questions. I thought that is the kind of mind that I want to train myself and my own children and my students to think like. And when I finished the Meno for the first time, I thought that was it. Like, that's it. They didn't answer the question, and that's not the point.
Right.
But at least as far as if I'm reading this with the framework of a teacher,
yeah,
and pedagogy, because many of my students and many that I know in the modern world are really obsessed with getting the right answer. We have a standardized test we've got to do. We've got to provide the right answer to the question. It's like, well, not whenever we have a conversation. Not always. We're trying to. Hopefully we can. But if we don't, that's okay. And I thought the Meno was great for that. So have you thought about the Meno and in terms of pedagogy in the past? And if so, what do you think about it?
Yeah. I don't like it. It makes it too hard. I don't know. I mean, I agree with everything you just said. Which is probably why I was drawn to Plato once I did start reading him. Is that like there's something about even the way he answers the questions about recollection and numbing, where he's answering the questions without really like stating a definitive answer, I guess. There's still room for discussion, and he's trying to operate or answer the question within a framework that Meno is capable of perceiving for himself. And so I don't like I like not having answers. You know, Do you watch any
Me too.
series?
Oh, I don't. But I'm probably familiar with the various contours of certain shows. What are
So
you thinking?
just when it comes to TV series, like if you watch a drama, um, the shows almost always end with like no answers, right? It just ends. Like, I'm trying to think. Like, there was some TV show that I used to watch called The Americans. It was like two Russian spies that lived in America as Americans. Like, they just acted like they were American. I don't remember. I mean, the show was good, but I don't. It was probably was like, a show you watch after the kids go to bed, kind of thing. But it was good as far as like it was thought provoking. And I remember that show ending and like not giving, not really telling you what happened to anybody. Like maybe like hints or something, but then it just kind of ends. And then I watched like the end of Parks and Rec, a comedy, and it tells you what everything that happened to every single character you ever encountered in the show, and it even like fast forwards to the future so you can see them living in that timeline, right? Like this is what happened to them, this is what happened to Ron, and this is what happened to so and so. And there's something about like that just seems to be common. Like comedies, TV shows that are comedies try to answer all the questions. They tend to answer all the questions. And TV shows that are dramas tend to not. And the ones that do try to, like Lost, everybody hates it, right? People hate the ending because it answered all the because it answered all the questions, but also because it answered all the questions horribly. And I don't know, like the thing is, like the comedy's trying to provoke you to think about try to provoke you to think a certain way, right? Or maybe not necessarily think in a certain way, but try to kind of maybe break you out of your thinking. But in the end, like it for some reason they're perfectly comfortable just tying it all up into a neat bow. Where the longer dramatic shows are, I don't know, they're raising more questions and then they're intentionally not answering. When I read Aristotle, I feel like I'm watching a comedy, and when I read Plato, I feel like I'm watching a drama. Like one guy gives me all the answers, and the other one never gives me or rarely gives me.
Interesting. It is strange that that we love the quest, the uncertainty, the searching without finding fully is thrilling for humans. It's one of the reasons why I love the ending of the Lord of the Rings series, because at the very end, Frodo and Bilbo go over to Valinor, and he's separated from his companion Sam. What do you mean? Like, what's going to happen with Sam and Frodo? Like, of course, Sam's going to have his wife and his kids, and they're going to live happily in the Hobbit in the Hobbiton with Merry and Pippin. But are they going to see each other again? And what's Frodo going to do or say when he meets the Valar? And what about Sauron? Like Sauron's immortal. Like, and like all these unanswered questions that like make it. I wouldn't have it any other way. Like that bittersweet moment wrapped together with the uncertainty of their futures. Like that's perfect.
Yeah.
And I just wonder. I can't help but think you won't know until you die and you cross over that if the new heavens and the new earth will be just a whole other level of eternal excavation, like an eternal quest to know Christ and God and his creation more fully, where we don't know it all and we don't want to know it all because we love learning more and more,
Yeah. There's this really great booklet. It's really small. I mean, I bet it's 70 pages. I don't know. And it's It's called The Beloved Unknown. And in that book, the author, he's going through Platonic dialogue, Plato's dialogue, but he makes this argument that the thing that you're trying to pursue, virtue, in this case, right? I mean, in the case of Meno, right? You're trying to pursue what is virtue. You have to love it to want to pursue it. So it's the beloved, but it has to be unknown, otherwise you won't pursue it, right? Which is the whole thing with the slave boy and the numbing and all that, right? The moment the slave boy thinks he knows something, he doesn't have to think about it anymore.
Yeah.
And because Meno enters this conversation thinking he knows what virtue is, he doesn't even bother to ask what is it, right? He just wants to move on to this next tangential question. And so it has to be unknown and it has to be beloved. But there's this process by which you come to know, and yet there's always a remaining unknown. And that allows me to continue loving it so it can remain and therefore continue pursuing it. But the moment he's arguing it, that this is in Plato, the moment I can conclude that I know it.
Hey, Lori.
Hey, sorry, I was just getting on, and I'll just mute it until you're done.
Or
I'll just hop off.
Oh.
All right, thanks.
Give us 2 minutes.
Sure.
Hey, Lori. That's one of my Greek students. She's coming on. I'm gonna teach her some Greek. Like I use the same link for it.
Nice. Okay. Well,
I'll edit that out. Yeah.
it has to remain unknown. And the moment you feel like you know it, you're going to stop pursuing it and kind of stop loving it, which in popular language, you hear when you hear people say, well, my wife's no longer a mystery to me. And I love her, but I'm not in love with her. And so I'm going to get a divorce. Right.
Yeah.
Theologically, that's almost what necessitates that God is ultimately, even in eternity, unknowable, right? So long as he remains unknowable to us in eternity, in heaven, we will forever, for all eternity, be pursuing him and loving him. And it'll kind of be like the days of Genesis, right? Where God does the days of Genesis, and at the end, he's like, that's good. But then the next day, he's like, I'm going to do more. And then at the end of that day, he's like, that's good. He's like, I'm going to do more.
Yeah.
Right. Every day in eternity, every day of eternity, I can end the day saying, that's good. Like what I learned about God and what I experienced from God today is so good. And I can be satisfied with it. And then the next day, want more. And there will always be another day to want more. And there'll be more to want. So I think it's kind of like that. And I think Plato,
that's good,
is trying to draw us into that through the dialogues, which is why he rarely gives us final and complete answers. And even then, most of those aren't very satisfying.
That's really good. Well, Matt, I wish we had longer. But I think this was sufficient. This was much better than I anticipated. I hadn't thought about. I hadn't made any connection between the way this dialogue ended and our pursuit of Christ before, and so that's beautiful. So,
well, thank you. I would do it anytime.
Thanks for having.
You're a good reader. I like the way you read. I like the way you ask questions. I like the way you see things. So,
well, then let me send you an email, and we can read another dialogue together. You want to do that?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, cool. Let's do it. I'll send you an email, and we'll get together. I'll and Lord willing, I'll see you at the next regional conference in Dallas. I think it's coming up in the fall.
Yep, it's fall.
So
see you there.
All right.
All right.
God bless.
Too.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossahus offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahus.com today. Glossahus, language resources for the global community.